Hello YouTube and welcome to Musicology for the People. So for the past week I've had the Modern Major General aria from the Pirates of Penzance stuck in my head. So I thought that for today we would talk about Gilbert and Sullivan. William S. Gilbert and Arthur Sullivan were two halves of possibly the greatest theatrical collaboration of the 19th century. They worked together from 1871 to 1896, writing 14 operettas during that time. But let's learn about their background, shall we? Gilbert, the elder of the two by 6 years, was born in London in 1836. At the age of 2, he was kidnapped by Italian brigands and had to be ransomed back to his family. But after that, his childhood was pretty normal. On top of his usual studies, Gilbert also trained to be an artillery officer, with hopes to participate in the Crimean War. Sadly for his aspirations, the war ended before Gilbert could graduate school, so he instead joined the militia, which he was a part of for about 20 years. Since he couldn't go to war, Gilbert instead got a desk job in the government, which quickly began to suck all joy and happiness from his life. His only solution to this predicament was to change careers and become a lawyer. Unfortunately, this too seemed doomed to fail, as his law career ended after only a few years. During this time, he began to write anonymously for the popular British magazine Fun. He wrote comic verse and even some cartoons, and some of the characters from these cartoons and verses actually make appearances in his later works. He also began to write some plays at this time, and he had this idea of raising up British stage theater to a more elevated and respectable form of entertainment. Sullivan, on the other hand, was born in 1842 and showed remarkable musical talent from a very young age. In fact, by the time he was 8 years old, he could play every instrument in the military band. In the summer of 1856, Sullivan was the youngest entrant into the first Mendelssohn Scholarship, a competition for young musicians. Despite being the youngest entrant, Sullivan won and was then educated at the Royal Academy of Music in London, and then later finished his music education in Leipzig, Germany. After graduating in Leipzig, he returned to England, where he soon became one of the most beloved young composers that London had ever beheld. In 1871, Gilbert and Sullivan were brought together for the first time to collaborate on a Christmas extravaganza called Thespis. This piece was a parody of grand opera and included a lot of satire, and it was about Greek gods who were getting too old, and so they were temporarily replaced by 19th century actors and actresses. Despite its silliness and its very quickly thrown together preparation, it enjoyed pretty great success, running for 63 performances. It took another 4 years for G&S to come together again. This time they collaborated on a short piece called Trial by Jury that poked fun at Gilbert's time as a lawyer. This piece was such an immediate hit that the collaborating duo were soon in demand for more operettas. Their first international hit came about 4 years later with the H.M.S. Pinafore. H.M.S. Pinafore is a light operetta that makes fun of the British Royal Navy and the British obsession with social status. This opera also marked the beginning of Gilbert's new idea of British theater. He was so involved in the actual production of his work that he was in charge of directing all of the actors and actresses, and also was overseeing the production of the sets and costumes. He had bold new ideas for English theater, such as realism in his acting, and for all his absurd characters to not have any clue how absurd they really were. The results spoke for themselves. Pinafore ran in London for 571 performances, making it the second longest running piece of British theater. Pinafore was quickly followed by the Pirates of Penzance, focusing on a main character who finds himself suddenly become a slave of duty. This is my favorite of the G&S shows, and if you have Netflix, there's a great movie version with Kevin Kline, Angela Lansbury, and even Linda Ronstadt. After the success of Pirates and Pinafore, Gilbert and Sullivan were given their own theater, the Savoy Theater. The most successful opera to be produced at the Savoy Theater was The Mikado. The Mikado satirized British bureaucracy behind a thin veil of being set in Japan. This opera also coincided with the opening of trade between England and Japan, making a Japanese setting incredibly fashionable. When asked why he decided to set this opera in Japan, Gilbert said, "There's really no good reason that we set it in Japan, other than it gives us the opportunity to have some really cool sets and characters." After The Mikado, Gilbert and Sullivan wrote several more operas together until a conflict arose between them. Gilbert and Sullivan found themselves on opposing sides of a financial and legal situation, which consequently ended their partnership. They were later brought back for 2 more operas, but they were nowhere near as good as their previous works and enjoyed very little success. They were actually pretty salty towards each other for quite some time, but apparently by Arthur Sullivan's untimely death in 1900, the two were quite amiable and very respectful of each other. Gilbert survived Sullivan by 11 years, despite being the elder of the two. His death was as heroic as his youth. He died by jumping into a lake to save a young lady, having a heart attack, and drowning. Even after their death, the Savoy Opera Theatre continued to stage their works until 1982, when the theatre eventually closed. During its life, the company gave over 35,000 performances of G&S works. Now that the operas are all in public domain, they are performed ruthlessly and all over the English-speaking world. They are also performed in both operatic and musical theater venues. It's not often that a work can cross over the divide between musical theater and opera, but Gilbert and Sullivan work knows no bounds. I hope you learned something new about Gilbert and Sullivan, and as usual, there are links down in the description with some great performances of their works. I hope you take the time to check them out. They are definitely worth it. These operettas are absolutely hilarious, and I take no shame in saying that I love Gilbert and Sullivan. Be sure to subscribe and check out the Facebook and Twitters associated with this channel. Until next week, ho, Mikado! Musicology.